Hey guys, last video we spoke about the fact that we were going to map out a basic reading of Locke. Today, well now, what we're going to do is we're going to do a more in-depth reading of Locke. So we're going to use what we talked about here when we were doing this visual concept map, and we're going to use the prior knowledge that we gained while putting this all together to then reflect on and get more meaning out of what he says here. Or maybe the other way around. We're going to read this to add to what we understood when we were trying to put all this together here, okay? So let's go over the goals again. We've already done a visual map of a simplified outline of Locke's arguments and theory, okay? What we haven't done is we haven't read the extracts, and we're going to do that really soon, and we're going to make sure that we keep coming back here to relate to what he says here, okay? Then what we're going to do is, again, we're going to see how he, with words this time rather than using concept maps, arrived at the principle of individuation for a person, which in this case is related to memory and consciousness of memory, okay? Then we're going to have a look at the objections that he's written out, that he anticipates, and that is, what if I lose memories, or what if I'm not in a state to be totally aware of all those memories? And then we might look at how he suggests that this definition of a person, or this principle of individuation that helps us define what a person is, can be used to explore issues of moral culpability or ethical culpability. So just, for me, stop right now, have a look at these 5 success criteria, and reflect on what it is that you know and what you still have to know. Okay, so let's go through and do a reading. Right, so again, it's all on Google Classroom, it always is. If you need to get today's concept map, there it is. If you need the PDF, which you probably should read yourself, it's right there. Here are the success criteria, and here was the video, the previous video where we did the skeletal concept map, okay? Now, we have the actual extracts here that we're supposed to read, and every single section that's supposed to be read has been highlighted, okay? One thing we need to also notice is that there are kind of references to same man, same body theory here, which helps us kind of make a tie between what we covered in the first couple of lessons of the personal identity unit and what he's talking about here in the writing. All right? Now, let's start. The first thing he says is that man is not human and human is not person, right? And here in this chapter, in this section, he's going to kind of outline how that's the case. Now, I don't know, it's kind of related to the point of individuation that he has between, he talks about a man, and then he talks about a substance, I think. So the stuff that we covered in the preparation for the readings, where he looks at substance, man, and person, and makes those divisions. What he's talking about here is kind of related to it, except I think man and human are kind of a bit ambiguous. It's ambiguous of what they actually mean. Sometimes he's talking about the substance, the material arrangement of all the molecules. And sometimes he's talking about the fact that it's all been arranged to perform the functions of a living organism. But what's quite clear is now we're going to read the section where he argues that there's a difference between a person and a difference between man. Let's have a look. Alright, section 8, same man. An animal is a living, organised body, and consequently the same animal, as we have observed, is the same continued life communicated to different particles of matter, as they happen successively to be united to that organised living body. So, I think he's talking about the fact that the animal is the arrangement of all the particles of matter to achieve that unified purpose, which is continued life. Right? Pretty easy. That's how he, at the moment, is defining man. And whatever is talked about of other definitions, ingenious observation puts it to past doubt that the idea in our minds of which the sound man is in our mouths is the sign, have no idea what he's talking about there, is nothing else but of an animal of such certain form. So what he's saying here is that what we are is we are an animal of a particular form. Right? Easy. And since I think I may be confident that whoever should see a creature of his own shape or make, though it had no more reason all its life than a cat or a parrot, will call himself a man. Whoever should hear a cat or parrot discourse, reason and philosophize, will call or think of it of nothing but a cat or a parrot, and say that one was a dull, irrational man, and the other was a very intelligent parrot. All right, what I need to do here is kind of explain to you what he's going to talk about in this section. So what he's talking about here is if we see a man who has the shape and the form of a man, we will assume that he's a man. He might not be very bright, but we'll still call him a man. If we see a parrot that can actually engage in philosophy and have a decent conversation with him, we'll still call it a parrot. However, we'd easily argue, though, that that's a very intelligent, rational parrot. Okay? So, let's have it, nothing but a carrot, and say the one was a dull, irrational man and the other a very intelligent, rational parrot. A relation we have in an author of great note is sufficient to countenance the supposition of a rational parrot. His words are, doesn't really come out as to who he's referring to with Maurice's parrot, but I'm not going to read this because it'll just confuse you to no end. But what you do need to take a note about is this. First of all, you need to take a note about the fact that he says it's the shape, the physical shape of the animal that we see that allows us to conclude what it is, right? Secondly, if you see a parrot that's capable of reasoning or thinking, then you would call that an intelligent, rational parrot. If you see a dumb man, then you call him a dumb man, all right? So just quickly take that note, and then I'll explain to you what the story is about, but I won't read it because you're just like, oh, what are you talking about, all right? Okay, so in this story, what Locke is trying to do is he's trying to provide us an example of the rational parrot. So he talks about Maurice, Prince Maurice. He's so rich, he travels to Brazil, and when he's in Brazil, he hears a story about a very old and wise parrot. The parrot talks, it can only speak in Brazilian language, and he can only speak Dutch. So what happens is basically, in order to understand what the parrot is actually saying and have a conversation with him, he has two interpreters. One is a Brazilian who speaks Dutch, and the other is a Dutch who speaks Brazilian. And from his conversations with the two men, who obviously understand language in a different way because their native tongue is different, he concludes that the parrot is talking to him in a very rational, intelligent way. That's all we really need to know about this. The reason why that's really important, though, is that this little example is kind of like a thought experiment. It's a thought experiment that helps us understand that even though the parrot is exhibiting certain behaviors that would be very close to a rational thinking thing, right, which is what Descartes calls us, it still is a parrot. It's an intelligent, rational parrot. So he's trying to say the point of individuation at the level of your body, right, or the thing that differentiates a man from something else is the fact that it has a particular form. Okay? Take a note. Alright, I'm going to stress again, make sure your notes have non-linguistic representations, make sure you are capturing as much detail as you can process in your own words, and stop, rewind if something doesn't make sense, and if it still doesn't make sense, then you need to write it down and say, I need to ask Mr. Ross about what he meant when he was talking about this. These are really important study habits to pick up, okay? So we can skip, no, we still have to read same man, section 8, same thing. So we go 8 and then we go 9. Alright, so after this example of the parrot, we read what he's saying. I have taken care that the reader should have the story at large in the author's own words. So there you go, I've quoted whoever came up with the story of Maurice's parrot. Because he seems to me not to have thought it incredible. In other words, most of us would think, my God, this parrot, it's reasoning with us philosophically, it's engaging in French, it's talking French to us, and it can speak Brazilian. What is going on? And he's saying, this is bizarre. The person who actually told us this story doesn't think it's strange. Just thinks what happens. For it cannot be imagined that so able a man as he, who has sufficiency enough to warrant all the testimonies he gives of himself, should take so much pains in a place where it had nothing to do, to pin so close not only a man whom he mentions as his friend, but on a prince on whom he acknowledges of great honesty and piety, a story of which, if he himself thought incredible, he could not but also think ridiculous. Most people would think this story is ridiculous. So he's saying, on this prince, this great honest prince, he's putting a story that he thinks testimonies to me not to have thought it incredible, because he seems to me not to have thought it incredible. Then he goes on to say, Grant Austin Pay, a story if he himself thought incredible, he could not but also think ridiculous. So if he, yeah, God, I hate the whole English writing, but what he's basically saying here is, if he thought it was incredible, he also has to assume that this is ridiculous. The prince, it is plain, who vouches this story, and our author who relates it from him, both of them call this talker a parrot. And I ask anyone else who thinks such a story fit to be told whether, if this parrot and all of its kind had always talked as we have a prince's word for it that this one did, whether, I say, they would not have passed for a race of rational animals. Yes, they would have. Most of us would have thought that if this was true, that parrot would have passed for a rational thinking animal. But yet, whether, for all that, they would have been allowed to be men and not parrots. Well, no, most of us would have concluded that they were parrots. For I presume that it's not the idea of thinking or rational being alone that makes the idea of a man in its most people's sense, but of a body, and so shaped and joined to it. And if that be the idea of a man, the same successive body, not shifted all at once, must as well be the same immaterial spirit to go on to making the same man. So what he's saying is, man, not person, can be defined as same body and can be defined as same and same spirit, right? Okay, take a note. So if you have a look, that kind of relates to the chimpanzee example that we're trying to talk about, right? So smart chimpanzee that can play chess is a thinking, highly intelligent, rational being, but it's not a man. This form clearly tells us the case. This guy has the form of a man, but he's not thinking. So therefore, he has the form of a man. He is a man, and that's why we put that down here. And the parrot is the perfect example. Okay? Let's go back to the reading. So personal identity, section 9. This being premised, to find wherein personal identity consists. So he's saying personal identity isn't necessarily the same thing as being a man. The man is defined by the body's form, and of course maybe the immaterial spirit, or the substance that makes the immaterial spirit as well. Right? So this being premised, to find wherein personal identity consists, we must consider what person stands for. So he's saying we must think about the definition of person, which I think is a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection and can consider itself as itself, the same thinking thing in different times and places. Take a note. This is so important, it's not funny. What did he say? Well, he said that it has to be an intelligent being. It's capable of reason and reflecting and can consider itself as itself, the same thinking thing at different times and places. Right? Take a note for a minute. So that in turn relates to the end conclusion here, doesn't it? I mean, we're talking about the fact that the key to understanding one's own self and one's personhood, or one's personal identity, is consciousness. And that requires a capacity to be aware of oneself in many different places and many different times. There's a continuity of existence, but an awareness of that, which relates to consciousness, okay? But let's go back. Now, he then goes on to kind of say other things that we still need to take notes on because they're quite important. So where do we stop? Which does not only by that consciousness which is inseparable from thinking, and as it seems to me essential to it. So he's saying consciousness is essential for thinking, which then allows us to be this person that we are. So consciousness is integral to being a person. One cannot think without being conscious. Therefore, consciousness is part of your personal identity. Take a note. It being absolutely, totally, 100% essential. Hang on, still looking. Which it does only by that consciousness which is inseparable from thinking, and as it seems to me essential to it, it being impossible for anyone to perceive without perceiving that he does perceive. Alright, so that's so important. And this is where you need to come up with your own non-linguistic representation of the notes. He says that consciousness is the only thing that allows us to perceive, right? So it being impossible for anyone to perceive without perceiving. So consciousness consciousness allows us to perceive that we perceive. It's like the Armstrong thing. It's an awareness of our internal states. So draw a picture that represents that and take a note. So what have you talked about? Again, like Descartes, it's the thinking thing, right? Reason and reflection. But then also, consciousness must exist. It must be aware in order to perform the action of thinking. It's essential to it. And this is because one cannot perceive that he perceives without actually being conscious. In fact, that's the definition of conscious. I should give you time to take a note. When we see, hear, smell, taste, feel, meditate, or when we meditate we don't mean what we usually think of meditation as at the moment, or will anything, here we kind of got like references to Descartes. We know that we do so. So when we perform a mental action, we know that we do it, is what he's arguing. Here we need to understand that this man is performing a lot of inductive reasoning. In fact, unlike Descartes, Locke isn't really a deductive thinker. He's a very empirical thinker. And what he's doing is he's just marrying observations, putting them all together to come up with philosophical conclusions. Nowhere in his argument is he really finding any word that implies the existence of some other concept. That's not going on in his logic. He's very empirical, even though he does borrow a lot of ideas from Descartes, which we can see, right? Thus, it is always as to our present sensations and perceptions, right? So we're always there. And by this, everyone is to himself that which he calls himself. It is not being considered in this case whether the same self be continued in the same or diverse substances. For, since consciousness may always accompany thinking, and it is that which makes everyone to be what he calls himself, and thereby distinguishes himself from all other thinking things. Right. If you haven't taken a note right now about the fact that consciousness implies thinking, but it's so integral to the self, and consciousness allows us to be aware of self, consciousness allows us to be aware of self, consciousness allows us to be aware of self, consciousness allows us to be aware of self. Yes, I'm repeating that deliberately because you need to take a note. You need to take a note. Another thing you need to do, which is incredibly important, is that when we think, we have an awareness of our thinking, which goes back to this definition at the top, where he says that it's consciousness that allows us to perceive the fact that we do perceive. All right? Note time. And thereby distinguishes himself from all other thinking things, and this alone consists personal identity, i.e., so he's saying personal identity is completely the ability to distinguish yourself from all other thinking things, because what you do is you have an awareness of yourself as distinct. Okay? Take a note. Alright, so if you have an awareness of yourself and your internal states, like Armstrong would have argued, this is very similar logic to Armstrong, though Armstrong came way later, you would pretty much be able to say, okay, well, I get it now. You know, he's basically saying what allows us to know ourself as ourself is our consciousness of ourself. And in this alone consists personal identity, i.e. the sameness of a rational being, that consistency of a rational being over time, and that awareness of the fact that we are that rational being over time. Take a note.